Welcome everyone to this week's episode of the Midnight Charette, hosted by myself, David Lee, and Marina Bourderonnet.
Okay. And what is this show about?
Oh, that's a very good question.
Broadly speaking, the entire show.
It's about anything and everything
that we want to talk about.
Yeah.
It's really the David and Marina show. Right. This week it's just the two of us, and this is a little bit of a different episode, but let's do the sponsors first.
Sponsors, if you are an architect and you're interested in doing a little better workflow than the usual, well, maybe you should consider using a BIM program. And if you're wondering which one, well, here you are. Go to graphisoft.com and look into ArchiCAD. ArchiCAD allows you to use simultaneously 2D and 3D modeling. All of your team could work on the same file simultaneously. It's compatible on Mac and PC. It's been around for quite a while, and we actually have an episode that talks in pretty good details about how to use this program in an architecture office. And that, I believe, was episode 169?
I believe so.
With Bradley Corey. So give it a shot. It should be pretty helpful.
And if you're stuck at home like most of us are, well, it's changing. People are going out and back to work. But maybe you're at the office and you don't feel like working because you feel like it's stupid. Then you should go online and do some shopping. Go to naadme.com. The company's Nod. And what's unique about... So they're an online retailer, right? They have goods, home goods, clothing, some clothing items, a lot of knickknacks and things. But what's different about their store is that they feature work done by young creatives from North Africa and the Middle East, and their items range in price and size and variety. We like their stuff, and if you use the code MIDNIGHT, you get 15% off your order. So head to nodme.com. All right. Okay, that's it for the sponsors. So this week, yes, it's just the two of us, and we're doing something a little bit different because with the whole pandemic, and working and living through Zoom, and then kind of social life happens through the filter, the keyhole of Instagram, mostly for myself, or through other kinds of digital platforms. This all reminded me of a presentation on a paper that I wrote and gave and wrote. Actually, it's been a while now. And so I thought maybe we could actually talk about those issues from there.
I see. So you're recycling old materials.
That's basically what...
Wow.
That's the first thing you learn in business school, is to recycle old material over and over again. Like when Nike designs a shoe, they don't design a new shoe. They just make it a different color or give it to Virgil Abloh. And then he does like quotes on it, and then it's worth a lot of money. So this is the same thing that's happening here. Instead of Nike and Virgil Abloh, it's myself and myself.
You want me to get out?
So should we give it a try? I don't know if this is going to be... This is an experiment.
You're starting sweating already?
This is an experiment because I don't know if it's going to be published as like a video presentation or just audio. And also because we're going to do it in two halves or two parts, because I was going through the material in preparation for this recording, and it was a lot weedier than I thought it was. So this might be a two-parter.
I almost wish I had some kind of outline so I could ask you questions, because what am I going to do here? Just sit and
No. You're going to ask questions, much like that we do for our guests.
To be awake. Oh, okay.
Yeah. See, typically you ask a few questions. Now you have to ask all the questions.
Can I ask them in French? We don't have a translator.
Yeah.
All right, let's go, baby.
So I guess to preface all of this, the thing that I wrote was one of the first papers I'd ever really written, and it was a kind of a culmination of a bunch of different knowledge I've gained over the years. And so, similar to doing a competition, it was an excuse to kind of work on some things that were in my mind. But as usual, I kind of bit off more than I could handle, because I tried to like, I didn't have... It wasn't like I did research during a semester, then I said, okay, I'm going to make this into a paper. These were all just floating ideas in my head. And I thought, okay, let's see if I can try and package it. Turned out to be it was a serious effort.
Yeah, and imagine me living with you at this time.
Yep.
This thing keeps like chasing me around.
So I don't think the paper itself, nor any of the presentations I gave, were very good. In fact, I think they're quite terrible. But maybe the ideas have some value.
Practice runs.
Yeah.
So you could do a good job today.
So the conference itself the theme of it was basically exploring how people interact with cities, how people engage with cities and these kinds of things. And for me, I was mostly interested in how digital technologies are a mediator between the person and the city around them. In other words, how do smartphones, social media networks, wearables, smart kiosks, how do those impact and shape how we experience things, how we relate to other people, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason why this is interesting to me is because, for the most part, architecture and urban design have been defined solely as physical practices, meaning like that's what we do. We create physical environments to shape behavior, to elicit reactions, to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's been, I think, the understanding of those two practices. That's for sure what we've been doing. But I think the reality is that we're well past the point of that physical experience being the only thing that dictates what a city is, if a city is a combination of experiences. So this is where my own interest in kind of virtual realities or virtual realms, digital realms, whatever you call them, comes into play. Does that make sense?
So do you think a city can exist without physically existing?
I think that the city is just defined by all of the experiences added together, and those experiences happen in two states right now. They exist both in the physical state, as they have been since our existence, and they exist in what I, in this kind of presentation talk, whatever, calling a virtual state, right? Okay, can it exist only in a virtual state? I don't, sure, if you're plugged into the matrix, why not? So what's kind of interesting about this too is that when I started this project, let's call it, I didn't really know where it was going to lead or how I was going to communicate any of my ideas, because the ideas were not formatted. They were just floating up in the abyss of my brain. But really at the end of it, it came down to kind of understanding, a theoretical understanding of the relationship between us as designers, the environments, the architectures, the cities that we create, and then the inhabitants. Those kind of three layers. And what I'm going to do is first describe the theoretical framework that I use to analyze these things. And it gets a bit obscure, yeah, for sure. And again, I don't claim that any of this is original, any of this is profound. This is just how I kind of perceive things. And it sort of ended up working in a way. Okay. That makes sense? Yep. So the analytical framework, there's three main ideas that have to be understood, concepts or whatever you want to call them. The first is the notion of form, the second of authorship, and the third is of platform. So when I say form, I'm basically drawing on a bunch of philosophers, and one of them would be like Plato, right? So form in the conceptual sense, meaning that there's a distinction between the conceptual and the real, and form is the conceptual, and any real object is basically an expression of its form. So one example would be like, so a pen follows the form of pen, right? The pen is a realization. It's trying to realize the perfect pen, right? Perfect is another word that can be associated with form in this case, okay? So pen follows the form of pen. A rock follows the form of the form of rock, and that applies to everything. So that applies to things that are man-made or nature-made. It applies to, anything and everything, including inanimate and animate, meaning living things and non-living things. So an easy example would be that of a circle, right? So there's a perfect idea of a circle. That's the form of circle. And when I go to draw a circle, that is the realization, the expression of that form, okay? Now, does that make sense? So form is also kind of parallel to the idea of rules. It's a set of rules that say this is a perfect version of something. And then when it gets realized, that thing is just trying to be as perfect as possible, as close to its form. Because it is a physical representation. Mm. Therefore, it lost some of its perfectness or whatever. Yeah, basically. So this gets to the idea of platform. And the platform is basically the space, the realm, the world in which the form is being realized, right? So conceptually, it's floating up above us as a circle. The platform in this case is the physical world, is being realized in the physical world. So that, and the reason why that there's a let's say a circle is a squiggly circle as opposed to a perfect circle is because.
So is a form a concept?
Yeah, you could call it that. Sure. Yeah, it's the conceptual version of something. It's the ideal version of something.
Oh, okay.
Right.
I see. Yeah.
Right. And
it's not the form as the shape only.
No.
Like...
Form has nothing to do with shape in this definition at all.
Just
at
being
all.
clear.
Yeah, that's a good thing to highlight. Now, the interesting thing is the reason why the form is imperfect when it's realized is because you're using physical material to realize it, which means that that physical material is being dictated by a different set of rules than that of the circle. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, you're using a third party that basically limiting the way you can represent that concept you're trying to represent, right?
Yeah, basically. So this is like a diagram, right? So you have the form of C, and it's being realized through physical material constructs, which are first dictated by the form of the physical world. So the point is that you have that the platform itself has a form that it follows. And that form is different from, in this case, circle, which is why there's kind of discrepancy. Okay. Which is to say then, therefore, when I go to draw a circle, or if a pen is an easier example because a circle is an illustration, so it gets confusing. If the pen is a physical realization of the ideal form of pen, right, that we could say this pen that I'm holding is follows two forms. It follows the form of the physical world first, that's the primary form, and the second one is the form of pen. Does that make sense, sort of? And this gets to the third idea, which is of authorship. So authorship is basically the act of willing or forcing or manipulating something to represent an ideal form. So if I were to make this pen with whatever tools, fabricate this pen, I'm authoring the pen, right? The level of authorship I have over this object is basically how close I can make this thing be ideal. Does that make sense?
It's interesting to think about that in terms of like being an architect and designing a building. Like, are you really
100%.
the author of the building you're designing if you're like extremely removed through multiple layers, right?
Yes, it gets complicated. So in a very stupid way, if you envision a star and I go to draw the star, if I do really shitty drawing of the star, then I have a low degree of authorship over it, right? And that's to do with a number of things, but certainly the discrepancy between the form of the platform and the form of the ideal star is one reason why there's a low resolution outcome. Okay, does that make sense so far? Yeah. When I gave this presentation to one of the schools, I had a feeling like all the students were like, "What the fuck what's happening right now?" We can therefore say that actually the pen has two authors as well as two forms, and they're parallel. So the primary author of the pen is the physical world, and the secondary author is myself, right? Because I'm using stuff that's native to the physical world to create
what therefore is the form that you created actually the form you tried to create, or just a new form?
Oh, interesting. Yes, this is the question that will come up. So this means then, therefore, that there's another idea of total realized form, which is that it's the product of all these things we've discussed, in addition to the fact that there are other things existing in the platform, and how this pen interacts with other elements dictates the total realization of it, right? Because the whole pen circle thing is basically talking about something in isolation, but in most platforms that have any meaning, they don't exist in isolation. They're a platform for multiple things.
When you said total realization, do you mean like perfect realization?
No, I mean just the what matters complete? Kind of in the complete, like what's actually happening, right? Like it's not enough to say that, oh, I made the pen exists out of physical stuff, so that's it, that's all that happens. Well, no, the pen can be used in different ways by different people, by different things, and that defines its total realizedness, its realized form. So in terms of let's say tying it to architecture and things like this, we have the platform, which in our case is like the physical world. We're the designer or the author, and then we manipulate material constructs, or the builders do, to create an environment, right? And how other people interact with that environment is the total realization of what we're trying to create. So that's like a very fundamental theoretical, kind of discussion. And what's interesting to me is that now, this has happened also when we were living in New York City, when all this happened. When you watch people like in public space and they're walking around and things like this, like we don't just experience a physical city anymore, as I was saying. So if you're on the subway and you're, fully engulfed in Instagram, I would kind of argue at that point that you're actually inhabiting more a virtual state rather than a physical one. Now, is it totally 100% one or the other? No, it's not 100% one or the other, but I think it's strong enough to where basically our experience of the city is fragmented because we hop between, more or less, we hop between one state or the other. The physical and the virtual, as I'm calling it, they aren't overlaid. We don't have an augmented reality, right? They're not meshed. They're not interconnected, and we don't experience that. We tend to experience either on or off.
Well, it's like, I think I would think about it like, you speak two different languages, like you just like turn one on and turn one off. Like there is no transition necessarily between the two. Yeah. Or even like relationships sometimes. There's
no relationship. So it's this kind of, this flipping switch that I think is an issue. And so what this also means in terms of experience is that the experience of the city, and this is a theme that's going to come up later on, is no longer a continuous thing. It's not a continuous journey of
it's chopped off.
Here, we're there. We just did a recording with someone where we talked about this actually. You have frames and a storyboard. It's not a continuous storyboard of frames that make sense. You have kind of this jumping around. It's very schizophrenic. So that's the theoretical kind of stuff. Easy enough, I hope.
Yeah, you just gotta stay focused, but yeah. Okay. If you blink once, that's it.
So I think a good way to approach the rest of this is that first we kind of talk about, use that to analyze the physical world we occupy, and then eventually the virtual world, and then talk about and then we speculate what's the future?
Well, and the physical world that we occupy right now too, and the virtual one.
What does that mean?
Well, when you did that presentation, there was no COVID-19, and right. People were actually still going out in streets and looking at things and experiencing different spaces, right? Yeah. Now we're pretty confined in one space and the other, so it may be a slightly different.
Yes. So that's another good point, is that each of these chapters or the entire thing, I don't mean to say that each of these segments is the end all be all way to understand it. It's just one direction, one point of view. Right. And the way that I kind of approached this effort and how to communicate things was okay, if we can understand the big picture through one keyhole really well, and we repeat that process 100 times or half a dozen times, right, then we have a really good understanding of the big picture in very specific ways, and therefore a better understanding of the big picture. And all of it ties together eventually. Eventually. So that's where this next part about analyzing the physical world, it's kind of stripped down. It's a very stripped down, basic physical world. We're going back in time, sort of.
Got it. Crocs and scissors and cavemans.
Perfect. So terminology, the first thing is that the form of the physical world in what I created, I called nature, N, abbreviated. For anyone who's religious, you could say it's God. I don't really want to get into that, but just the form of N. I didn't choose P because P is the same as person. It got confusing. So just N, nature. I know nature has connotations, but N, nature, physical world. So that's to say everything within it first follows the form of nature, because that's the primary form. So rock follows the form of nature. Water behaves according to the form of nature, right? A rock doesn't decide how it's going to behave. It just is.
Today, I'm just going to roll around town.
Right. It's not dictated by something else. It just is. And even when you think about a pig, though it's an animate being, also does not really decide how it should behave, right? Its existence, i.e. its behavior, is dictated by the form of nature. Because a pig just eats, it sleeps, it shits, and it just does. The same thing with a bug, the same thing with et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it follows the form of its DNA, basically, right?
But this, okay, so the distinction I'm making is that if we say the form of nature and pig are one and the same, right, that does not apply to the form of a person.
Well, the form of the pig is predictable.
The form of the pig, it has to do with intellectual capacity, right?
Yeah, it's predictable. I mean, a pig that starts like walking on its 2 legs, well, there's something crazy with that pig because no pig would ever do that.
Exactly.
Right?
Now, again, this is a good example of this is not the end-all be-all. Like, how do you deal with a monkey? Well, that's a little more complicated. Like, monkeys do things that are kind of outside of their natural state, you could say. So for sure, there's a delineation between pig and person, though, right? So a person has the unique capacity to choose how to exist in the physical world, which is to say that therefore they are governed by a form that's separate from the physical world. They're governed by a different form from nature. They have their own form. So, for example, a pig eats...
So nature is a platform?
Nature is the form of the platform.
Nature is the form. Okay.
Okay, right. We're in the physical world. There's rules about it, right? There are rules of how things work and etc. And those rules are the rules of nature. Okay. And when a pig eats, it doesn't really, there's no larger reason to dictate behavior other than that of survival. And survival is the same thing as nature. This is different from when a person eats, because when we choose to eat, we don't do it just to survive. We don't do it for reasons having to do with only nature or survival, right? We have an additional set of rules that we follow. We dress up in fancy clothes. We make things look nice. We choose things. We choose what to eat based on taste. There's a whole bunch of things that we create for no reason.
Well, it seems like it's the idea of that dual authorship, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like there is the us, the me, Marina. I'm the author of myself and my choices, and then there is like nature, which is also the owner of some of my choices.
Absolutely, yes, yes. And I think this is easy to prove. And we're weird. Human beings are weird, and it's easy to say that we have our own form because we go to the extreme. In fact, a lot of the behaviors we decide to do actually contradict that of nature. Like we choose to starve ourselves. We choose to protest this. We choose to smoke. We choose to, I mean, if we're talking about just our bodies at this point, right? We choose to eat weird things. We choose to put ourselves in danger. We choose to fucking light ourselves on fire and protest. The complete opposite of what nature says we should be doing. Therefore, we have our own form, right? I think that's reasonable.
Yeah.
So what does this mean? That means our behavior, as you were saying, is a product of two things. It's us trying to express our form, our self, but we're doing it through the corporal body that we're given. We don't have control over this body. We're given it, right? We don't invent it. So we can think of our form as what? Our set of principles, our social identity, our philosophies, all of those kinds of things. And of course, culture. We express the form through how we behave, and of course other things like what we wear, what we design, what we make. So food becomes cuisine, clothing becomes fashion, and shelter becomes architecture. This is tying into the idea, of course, that architecture is not about survival and it's not about shelter, right? It's about something else.
So it just sounds to me like our self-expressing our form is just making everything superficial.
What do you mean?
Well, like fashion.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, in the time of pandemic, to me, fashion right now is completely useless. Because fashion really matters when you go out and other people look at you. If you're at home, you could be wearing nothing or your sweatpants. Really, it doesn't really make any difference.
It's true, but it's weird to think that, like, what percentage of our lives are really dictated by our own form, our own made-up reasons for doing things.
Well,
it's pretty much like 95% of it.
But is it dictated by our own form, or is it other people's form that's dictating that to us?
It's for sure that as well. So scaling this now to architecture a little bit. So not only, again, do I dress myself, clothe myself a certain way, but I create other things to express it, right? An example is like a pew, which is a weird example. Like, you know, the bench and the church. Like, it's not a weird example because it's super generic, but, you know.
I don't want to talk about religion, but I'm going to use a pew.
That's also why I threw it in there. So the pew is something that, say, a person creates. It's a manipulation of material constructs to try and produce certain results, right? So it is an expression of form, one in itself, and two, it's an expression of form because it supports behavior that is an expression of that form as well, i.e. praying. The pew itself has value with form, and the behavior it allows or hopefully encourages, dictates, whatever, is also further than that. Right? Because we talked about total realization of form, this is what it means. And then thirdly, it expresses form by networking with other things to create a larger environment. Rows of pews, I don't know, nave, whatever the fuck, church, right? All of that is big. They're components in a system that are trying to express this idea of form, right? So we have to remember, though, that when we try to realize ourselves, our forms, it's imperfect. Now, this might sound like a bad thing, but in fact, in a individual level, it's quite interesting and productive, because I think what that means is that I have an idea of myself, I try to express it, I fail because it's inherently impossible. And that discrepancy between conceptualization, between the concept and the realization of that concept, means there's a feedback loop between those two. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And that's a really important thing, actually. The fact that the form of the physical world, of the platform that we share, is different from us, which means that we realize imperfect things, means that there is always this continual loop. Because embedded within this whole discussion, whatever you want to call it, is the idea that architecture and urban design has always been about basically creating better lives for more people. We can say that, right? And in a theoretical sense, the fact that, again, the physical world is so different from us means that it's going to incite evolution and growth, because that process is reciprocal. It's always one of trying to express something, it didn't happen, and there's that feedback loop over and over and over again.
Sure. I'm trying to think of, like, you know, like terrible buildings, for example.
Okay, an easy way to think about it, like just at the scale of a person. I feel like I want to be a certain way. I go out into the world, I dress that way, I try to be cool, or I'm wearing a leather jacket, or whatever the fuck. Doesn't quite work. I got to go back and try and tweak it or do something. But the fact I wasn't able to do it perfect is one reason why it causes me to constantly be evolving and changing or to grow.
But that's if you are willing to do that, and if you're interested to do that, and if you even are aware that you failed. Like Frank Gehry's Walt Disney Concert Hall, to me, is a huge failure. Right. I don't know that he's thinking about it the same way as I'm thinking about it. And I'm not sure that since he did it, he tried to do better work. You know what I mean? Mm.
That's true. I think people like Frank Gehry just have problems. He's an anomaly. Now, generally speaking, there's this kind of feedback loop, right? I mean, it's the same with the design process, right? You have an idea of what you want to draw, and you try to create it, it doesn't work. That's the thing. That becomes the step to the next step.
I think there is a feedback loop if you allow it to be there. I just don't think that it's always there. It's on a
no, it's not
thing.
Always. There's another component too, as you said, self-will or whatever. But the fact that we can only imperfectly realize things means that the platform itself is helping along that process.
So it's helping us just trying harder and harder and harder. But if we know that, whatever we're gonna make is always gonna be imperfect, then why keep trying?
Because that's not what we're drawn to. It's a weird thing that at the same time we search for perfection, but at the same time we know it's not achievable. So why do we do it? Well, that's like at the center of the universe, isn't it? Because of God. I mean, you know,
like
that's the level that I think we're getting at. So this is the other aspect to which you were alluding to, of like different forms interacting within a shared platform. So if we take two forms A and B, right? If form A is realized in platform A, it's perfect. If form B is realized in platform B, it is perfect, but they can't coexist. They're in different platforms, which is to say that the only way form A and B can coexist and interact, etc., is through a platform that shares a third identity, form C, right? So C plus A can interact with C plus B because they have C related. There's different ways that these different forms can interact. There's, I think, reductive and additive ways. And an easy example would be reductive. To start with reductive, an easy example would be like take a plastic water bottle. Plastic water bottle follows the form of N, nature. It follows the form of water bottle, W, whatever, right? Someone else can come along and interact with this thing to express another form. The reductive way is to strip it down to its primary form, which is that of nature, to create something else. For example, I find a water bottle, I recycle it, I squish it down to raw plastic, its raw, natural, whatever, state, to create a grocery bag. There is nothing about the form of water bottle that has been used to create the grocery bag. I'm just using it for its primary form material. Make sense? This is different from the additive process, where I take form N plus W, the water bottle as a physical thing, and I use it for, I don't know what, an architectural installation. Easy example, everyone's seen those, right? The installation I've created now is an additive. It follows the form of the physical environment, follows the form of water bottle, plus whatever new identity life I've given it. And what's interesting about how these things how these different things interact is that at some point they produce new forms altogether, which is what you said earlier, right? So N plus W plus I water bottle installation becomes NZ at some point, right? And more in the, I don't know, sociological kind of understanding of things. This kind of interaction happens every day in cities and public spaces. I would
happened every day.
Happened every day, yeah. So what does this mean? That means in order for growth, evolution, progress, whatever you want to call it, to occur, one, the person can't be a Frank Gehry. They have to have that in them, perhaps. But also it requires a platform that is different from your form and is different from the form of the other people. Does that make sense? So, and the more equally distinct we are from that platform, the more equal that platform or the more neutral it is to accommodate the expression of different ideas. So this, of course, is super important for us because we all have different ideas and we need to coexist in a certain kind of space. So basically, that this theoretical kind of understanding is what's necessary, and this is how we have democratic spaces. So architecture is, in a way, trying to dictate behavior or understand behavior of people, incite behavior, right? That's one way of understanding it. And this means that the relationship between architecture and inhabitants is kind of like an inverse relationship. So the more authorship I have over my architecture means the less authorship inhabitants have within it, right? Which is to say that nature is a kind of buffer between me as an author and the inhabitant. Nature is what allows there to be. Nature is why architecture is a stage. It's a platform. People say this, right? Architecture is a stage, is a platform, or whatever. This is why architecture is that, as opposed to something that's authoritarian to the total degree. So an easy example is like a restaurant. A restaurant might be created to eat, but in fact, you can do a myriad of things. You can scream, protest, you can streak, you can have a food fight, you can propose to someone, you can do anything in there. So again, this kind of theoretical space between our form and the physical world is basically what is allowing a bunch of individuals to do whatever they want, to protest, and is also what allows architecture itself to be a critic of other things, because this means that architecture is an expression of a conceptual form, yes, but it's also a host, a mediator, and even content toward the production of new things, right? So the low degree of authorship over architecture means there's space within it, and that space gets filled in with other ideas. So, so far I've been talking about how behavior is an expression of our form, right? But if we're going to go and talk about cities, you kind of have to understand behavior at not just the scale of someone putting on a piece of clothing or eating. It has to happen The understanding of behavior has to happen at a bigger scale, which is to say that behavior could be understood as a series of discrete activities. Okay, so eat, work, play are 3 kinds of activities. And let's say that everyday experience is composed of basically more or less those 3 activities, right? Make sense?
Yep.
And all those activities together basically are what defines total behavior, total expression of form. And if we say that each of these activities is a kind of a unit, we can say then therefore it's a destination, because each of these activities pretty much has a beginning and an end, right? So if I eat something, there's a beginning and end to that activity. If I play, there's a beginning and end generally. And when I work, there's a beginning and end. So this means that if all that is behavior, that means that my ability to realize form, that is my ability to control behavior, happens in 2 ways. It happens, one, being able to do one of those activities a very specific way. Like I was saying before, how do I eat? What do I eat? It also means on a larger time scale, I'm choosing the activities that I want to do, right? So if I can eat, play, work over and over and over again, if I choose to skip a bunch of those to only eat and play, that is another way to express form because I'm authoring behavior. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what this also means that the time and space between activities becomes really, really important. And now we get to city design stuff. You follow?
Sure.
Okay. You're so not convincing. So you're the audience. I'm relying on feedback from you to tell me.
I'm just waiting for this stuff.
Okay. So this is a kind of a weird thing in the physical world because of a couple of reasons. The first is that even though we know where I'm going to partake in a particular activity, I don't actually know if that activity is desirable or undesirable before it happens totally, because I'm existing in a shared platform. I'm choosing to go eat at this restaurant because I believe it's going to be desirable. I don't know if it is going to be desirable, right? Because there might be some crazy person there. The degree of knowing is lessened because of conflicting forms. Okay, which makes choosing what activities to do more difficult, we can say. The other is that we exist in the physical space, and therefore activities are located at varying distances. Some are harder to achieve than others because of physical distance we have to cross, right? This creates kind of an inequality in accessibility, right? So both of these things mean that the transition from one activity to the other has even more value than maybe we would think. For example, like walking from a restaurant to a movie theater, that would be the kind of space that I'm talking about, right? And those spaces, the structures of them that are shared between different people are even more important because they're basically a catalyst for interaction, okay? And very briefly, why that matters at all? Well, if the idea is if what we're going for is basically some kind of growth or evolution of the individual, of form, etc., then basically for that to happen, you have to be interacting with others, right? It's public space. You have to go out and see other people. Only by seeing other people and confronting them do you have a better understanding of yourself, your identity, your form, and turn question yourself, and etc., etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, that sounds great, but I'm just thinking okay, I'm in the street and I'm walking from point A to point B. This is supposed to be extra juicy time where things might happen and it's extremely precious and I can interact with people. But what, what is actually the percentage of results from those types of moments versus the number of time they happen and the time spent doing them,
It varies. So that's a good question because you have to kind of quantify or qualify those experiences and therefore assign value perhaps to those experiences and therefore assign value to the spaces that host those experiences.
Because I'm thinking, now that we're all quarantined, or some of us still are, you're inside, you're not exposed to walking by certain people, maybe falling on the street and having someone picking you up and start having a chat. But how many of those types of interaction really happen, and do we really not need them, but like, is it really a big miss, the fact that we're stuck inside?
Yes, it's 100% a big miss. Because the only way that we have a better understanding of ourselves, our values, and what we should become, right, is through this interactive process of seeing something else, something different, something that follows a different form, coming back on the other side of the line and thinking about it and then reformatting. But if you don't do that, there's no evolution at all.
But can you just use Netflix or Instagram stories, seeing like other people do other things to kind of think about that?
We will get there.
Oh my God, I'm so good at this.
We will get there, yeah. So that level of interaction is super important. And public space, for anyone that knows urban design, that is it. That's what fucking defines urban design. That's what defines cities. A lot of people like kind of devalue it because they think like, well, like, I mean, I was at a review once and this student was talking about public space and one of the critics was like, yeah, I don't really buy it. Like, so if I go to this area and I sit on a bench and I happen to be sitting next to like someone who's different from me, like, I don't know. It's not like I'm talking with them. It's not like I have a deep conversation. So what do I get out of it? And I'm like, that is so ridiculous to think that the only meaningful interaction you have with other people, the capital O other, has to be through deep conversation. Are you shitting me?
Quantifiable.
Like when you walk through Union Square and you walk through many of these cities, how much do you learn about people, yourself? How much do you think, how much introspection is caused by the experience just by viewing? A lot.
That's what French people do, people watching.
So this space is in a way kind of like the final arena in which ideas are tested, assuming the space has a plethora of identities, right?
An arena is an interesting word, actually, especially if you think like, okay, we're just going to throw all the forms we have of all of those people in one space and kind of just like see what happens.
Totally. So if you imagine, so what is the ultimate public space, and or public spaces that are successful now? How did they come to exist? Again, I put forth the idea that it's the transition between destinations that's important. Because if I go to eat at X or I don't know what, name a restaurant, I don't know, Giuseppe's restaurant, right? Presumably everyone there has something in common. We're all going to a Giuseppe's. For some reasons that might be different, but there's something similar there.
You like tomatoes. Right?
There's something similar. So the relying on destinations themselves as the time and space for this productive interaction is problematic because of that. Fortunately, again, we're in the physical world, so there's unpredictability about it. Okay, transitional spaces are where public space exists. So if you imagine though a sidewalk, and you have a group of people who all follow roughly the same form A, form A1, form A3, etc. And they all take the same path. There's very weak public space, obviously. You have a public space that's a transition where you have a bunch of different people taking it. That is very powerful and potent public space.
It's risky too.
It's very risky. So there's a couple of reasons why this works. The first is that the public space is neutral. The transitional space is neutral. It doesn't follow a form. Giuseppe's restaurant follows a very specific form. Someone created Giuseppe's restaurant, presumably their architecture, et cetera, right? It's trying to author the space. Transitional space generally doesn't do that because its purpose is not to its primary reason for existing is not to express this other form. It's just to get you from here to there. So the utilitarian aspect of public space or transportation, we could call it. And when I say transportation, I loop in sidewalks, streets, subways, all of it together. Any space and realm that you use to go from one place to the next, that's transportation zone.
But sometimes, I mean, if you take sidewalks, like the buildings along the sidewalks could be trying to author that transitional space.
100%, yeah. Yeah, varying degrees.
So it's not always neutral.
Well, there's privately owned public spaces and things like this, which is I would not argue or a lot of times they're not used.
No, but I mean like certain types of buildings will probably attract like Form A1, Form A2, or like Form C.
Yeah.
So in a way, they were kind of authoring what the transitional space is.
This is true. So okay. So first of all, like I was saying, one, the form of that space needs to be neutral in a way, or a form that's equally distant or different from everyone else's, right? The form of the subway is the form of subway. It's not form of Giuseppe's. And then also these spaces, this goes back to the utilitarian nature, is that they are not accessed, they're not desirable destinations, right? We just use them because we need to use them, which means then that you get a bunch of people who really don't want to be there, and they're in a way forced to coexist in this space and interact with each other because they didn't elect to be there. It just happens to be the one shared thing that I have to use to get to my destination. So this is where sidewalks and streets, powerful, right? It's the ground plane. Everyone can fucking share the ground plane more or less. You divide that space into street and sidewalk. It gets a little problematic, but still not bad. The subway, total divorced, deforestation. Totally divorced from that surface level down in the tunnel. That's a problem. But now there's so many people there, it's kind of its own thing. Freeways, well, that is an issue. Underground tunnels, that's a fucking issue, because it's no longer a space that has a neutral form. It's no longer a space that a wide variety of people can share, right? So the fact that these spaces themselves are not desirable is actually quite productive. The other is that public spaces are easily accessed, right? The easiest one is like the street, because it's native almost to the planet. It's there. In fact, it's only delineated because of things that we created. The more you make it difficult to access, the less potent it is. Subway's good because it's cheap, but freeways, you have to have a car. Underground tunnels, again,
you have to know how to drive on a freeway.
So in a sense, these kinds of spaces are incubators for the production of new forms or the evolution, the advancement of existing ones.
Well, that's a very hopeful way to look at it.
Well, the funny thing is that
it could also become a place where it's just problematic constantly. Nothing good comes out of it.
Well, there's the nuisance factor, and there's the base level of safety that's there that has to be enforced, right? But I would argue that that base level of safety falls into the realm of the form of nature, because we're talking about survival, right? Don't harm my form, nature, and body. Don't do that. But if I don't like what you're doing, hands off. I can't do anything about that, assuming it's there are lines to be drawn. That's where the policing of public space, yes, to protect our corporal selves, fine, but to do it to do it for this reason, or if it has the effect of limiting the conceptual forms of a person, the identity of a person, that's a problem. That's a super problem. That's an issue. And generally speaking, because we are weak beings and we like convenience and stuff, we have sought to erase public space and erase nuisance and erase undesirable experiences. I just want to get to my destination as fast as possible. Ideally, I wouldn't have to deal with all this other nonsense. I would just get there. That's a problem, because then your destination is chosen for specific reasons, and it's going to be shared by similar people. You're limiting that kind of exposure, right? So I think erasing or minimizing or chopping out these kind of transitions, I understand it totally. I fucking hate the New York subway as much as anyone else, but there's a limit to it before it's a detriment to the city. And the public space is where you get the sense of community. There's some other actual magical thing that happens when you get all these forms, A, B through Z, interacting. There's something else that exists that everyone recognizes as having importance. It has shape to it. It's enclosed in some way, and that's community. So, to wrap it up then for this portion. So, the physical environment is not created by us. It's only partially authored by us through the manipulation of its stuff, right? And therefore, anything that we create is only partially realized and it's not as imperfect. And therefore, unintended aspects and imperfections happen, which cause this reciprocal kind of understanding of ourselves to keep trying or to re-question. And the legibility is open. How other people interpret other people is another thing that gets thrown into this. So like the distance between the form and perfection and conceptual versus the realization is huge. And that's what allows all of this. This space is what allows for production to happen, production of forms and etc. And then the physical spaces that we create, the environments that we create, exercise minimal control, therefore, over social events. It suggests things at best, but really it's a low degree of authorship itself. And actually embedded with all of this is that I'm just talking about material constructs, right? Making a restaurant. There are the immaterial constructs that get thrown into this whole thing, which is that of basically government. What we choose to do to each other for just completely made up reasons. That's the other aspect that controls behavior, which I didn't really get into. But there's a material and immaterial, and both of those come into play. Important to understand, though, when we get to virtual realities. And this also means that authorship in this space is an additive thing. We're adding on to each other. And most importantly, no one has to try and access the physical environment because we are physical beings. We're here natively, right? Accessibility is open 100%. So true public space can exist because the physical world does not follow our form. It's some other thing, and it's a chore to be in. Does that make sense?
No, I think it's clear.
I mean, it's interesting to think that actually most of what we construct is basically just to delineate private space or to create private space, because the physical world in it by default
create is just fluff.
But the physical world by default is public space. It is the OG public space. All the other stuff we create is basically just variations or gradations of privacy.
No, that's what's insane, right? It's that we are like trying to create public space, like you're saying, but like there's day one of world one, when like all the form of human species, got made by God. We were just living in public space, and because it's open space, there was nothing, right? And the fact that then we started building private spaces, and because that's only how we exist and how we define cities and places is like through limitation. Now we have to reverse it back and recreate the things that was there originally. Right. Because we kind of destroyed it or forgot it even.
I think it's because...
I mean, it is kind of insane to think that, like, we didn't start a city. The city wasn't like a big block that was privately owned by somebody. Well, maybe it was, but like space-wise, it wasn't. Yeah. Like you could breathe the air of a city.
And this is where, I mean, there have definitely been varying degrees of authorship and varying degrees of control that cities have placed on people or buildings, right? And at some point, it becomes architecture can be a vehicle for very dangerous things. It can be a more neutral or platform, something that exists as potential content just to elicit and incite kind of this productivity that we're talking about. Or it can be something that's just to say, this is what I fucking am, and fuck everyone else. This is my form, this is my shape, this is my identity. I'm going to force it on you. And that combined, again, with the immaterial things we create, systems, governments, and whatever, policing, very dangerous. Very dangerous. And I think we do that one because we want to express our form, some of us more aggressively than others. We feel like we need to force it on other people. And also for more like the everyday person, it's just of convenience. It's of convenience. Why would I want to experience the subway when I don't have to? When I can go from my destination, the desirable destination, and the next, and just skip over all the crap, right? But we have found that there are problems with doing that, for sure. So I guess in the end, there's some kind of larger, in terms of physical realities, there's some kind of like larger understanding of I don't know if you would call it compromise, but that just doing what we've deemed desirable, and that kind of one-track mindset, almost is problematic,
Yeah, I agree.
No. Okay. So that's all the physical world stuff, right? Virtual world, also known as the digital world, whatever you want to call it. So the rest of this is actually quite short because that was the bulk of everything. So
Wait,
in
the
a
first
way,
part was short?
No, the first part was the longest part. That's like 3/4 of it. Yeah. So the rest goes quicker. In a way, the virtual world and how it's being used can be seen as kind of the extreme version of the physical. Like we were talking about the privatization of spaces and trying to create those delineations and trying to weed out and get rid of undesirable transitions and things like this. The virtual is kind of like the hyper version of that,
right.
The extreme version of that.
Right.
Now, what's interesting about the virtual, in a certain way, is that it doesn't have a form per se. Like it didn't start with anything. Like the physical world has a form that it follows. The virtual is kind of made up space that we created.
It could have any form.
It could have any form, we could say. Yeah, sort of, right? I mean, there are kind of limits to that, but they're roughly at least compared to like what we're given in the physical, that's certainly the case.
Well, it could have any form, but because we are the author of it, it is limited to what form we can give him.
Exactly. So that's both very freeing because that means we can kind of express things in new ways and potentially have much more control over those creations, authorship to the thing that we are making, much more than in the physical, and we can do new things. But that also means that we have to think about, again, the total realization of form or how everything is working. I mean to say that we don't just create this thing in a vacuum. It is created in a platform and other people occupy it, right? So it's not just about the degree of authorship I have over the thing I create in this virtual space, but it's also about how much that thing authors behavior of other people.
Well, it's the same rules applies basically to virtual and physical.
The same analysis, yeah.
The same framework on how things have to function related to each one.
Yes. So we could say in a way that because the virtual space, the virtual world starts without any kind of form, that whatever form we give it is the form it has. So in a sense, there's a certain type, there's almost like total authorship over the thing I create because there's nothing there before and there's no rules dictating it previously, okay? This also means, therefore, that if I'm an architect of an environment in this virtual world, that its form is total, and also whatever the behaviors of other people within that environment are entirely dictated by the structure I have created, right? Because I'm essentially creating a brand new environment, so whatever you do within that is dictated by the rules I set. Of course, you still have freedom, but again, now your authorship is secondary, like it was in the physical, but now it's secondary to my authorship. And this is a problem because the physical world form was neutral in a sense. N is different from me, N is different from you. It's there, right? There's a neutrality to it, which we talked about. In a virtual space, it's not neutral. It's someone else. It's a human being, and there are principles and ideas that are being put forth, right? So in the restaurant analogy, in the physical space, we can eat. That's what it's designed to do. We can do a bunch of other things. A restaurant in the virtual space, you only eat, or you only do whatever is dictating. Another dumb example is like Facebook, right? It's an environment, an architect created it. It is architecture. It is a space. People interact. Whatever interactions we have on Facebook, 100% dictated by what Facebook allows.
Yeah.
The only exception is if you're hacking, but that is such a small percentage of the population that it's not really worth acknowledging, or it doesn't have much meaning. So this is I think actually a very dangerous thing when you think about it, right? Because behavior is always first dictated by the author of that person, or even more frighteningly, the truth is authored by a corporation whose motives and principles might not be as, I don't know what, pure, as socially oriented as we would want.
But so because all of the digital like forms are limited to whichever technicalities they offer.
Yep.
Therefore, even if they have good intention, in a way, they are bad.
In a way, yeah. Because
they are taking control over what you want to do versus what you can be doing.
Good and bad is difficult, right? I mean, fortunately, we don't exist only within the virtual, so we have the physical to escape to. And the physical is kind of the reset. The physical is where there is that neutrality, where there is an ability to protest, tear walls down, these kinds of things. The walls in virtual space exist in totality, like completely, with supreme control. So good, bad, it's hard to say. I guess it depends. I think what makes it debatable is because we have the physical to escape to. If the physical didn't exist, then we would have to really question the motives of the creator, the corporation in most cases. This also means in the virtual state, it's not just a matter of freedom of expression of...
Well, if the physical didn't exist, we probably wouldn't even thinking about the digital this way. Because we wouldn't have anything to compare it to.
The digital would become the new physical in terms of what we perceive to be neutral.
Right.
But based on what we know, that probably wouldn't be the case. So there's an issue of control, but this also means that inhabitants are less able to critique the structures that they exist within, right? Criticism can only happen within the rules, which is kind of silly, right? Imagine and this goes back to the material and immaterial rules of the physical space that we occupy, right? We have government institutions, we have roads, freeways, walls, fences, whatever. And we have the immaterial, right? We have agencies, we have regulations, laws. Imagine if we lived in the physical world where we had to abide all of those, and that was our only choice. How could you ever even have a protest? A meaningful protest, right? It doesn't work. There needs to be the ability to completely blow past these delineations and these lines in order for a space to allow for democracy. So that's an issue. This also means that in terms of authorship, that there's far less co-authorship between the creator of the platform and the person, right? Before, like the water bottle analogy I was talking about, you could still do that within the virtual space. Actually, the virtual space is very good for things like that, remixing and et cetera, et cetera. But the total experience, again, still primarily defined by whoever that author is. So that authorship between person to person is not co-authorship. It's primary and very, very far secondary. And this is kind of weird in a way because, more conceptually speaking, you're actually collapsing the theoretical and the real, or the conceptual and the real. Before I was talking about the conceptual, the concept of form, I guess realize and it's messy or whatever, that all gets kind of flattened in a way. And whereas before, nature, as I described, served as a buffer between architecture and inhabitants, that's gone now. So you don't have those three things kind of negotiating each other. You just have architecture. And what's also strange is that when we occupy the virtual environment from a user standpoint, let's say like Instagram or Facebook or whatever, and I choose social media networks because I think there's a lot of virtual spaces to kind of occupy, but the ones where we network are the most meaningful. We think that we have a high degree of authorship over ourselves as compared to us in the physical. So going back to the really rudimentary, corporal self, I want to wear a leather jacket, pack my hair. I'm this person now, right? Doesn't quite flow in the physical world because of multiple forms and all whatever, right? In the virtual, we have the ability to author ourselves at a higher degree, or we think so, right? But the problem is that the way we author our identities in the virtual is through the reductive method rather than the additive method or something else. right? We're excluding information. Whereas in the physical, we try to exclude information, but it doesn't work. It is a mess for sure. And this is a problem in terms of the growth of form, evolution of one's form or oneself, because it's the same as a presentation. The more information you put out and the more people are reading that information and conveying and responding to it, the more new knowledge you have, right? This is the same exact thing as when you give a presentation as a student. If you give one sentence presentation and no one understands what the fuck you're talking about, you're going to get very bad feedback that's not going to help you. As opposed to being very clear and presenting a bunch of information, even stuff that's going to potentially hurt you, more growth, right? In the virtual, we're always stripping away stuff. So in other words, the critique and the feedback we get is very shallow because we're giving out shallow information, right? So this combined with the idea that there are in fact very few primary authors of virtual spaces, very few big companies, basically corporations at this point, and everyone else is a secondary author. I think it feels like to a lot of people that there is a greater sense of freedom in these kinds of spaces, in part because of the speed, perhaps. But all those things considered, I just said, there might actually, in fact, be less diversity because the variation that exists within these spaces is basically based on a very few themes. Few themes that are being dictated by a few corporations, and again, even fewer because what we choose to put out there is from a reductive process.
Yeah, and I mean, you put the algorithm on top of that. That's like even more.
The algorithm, yes. And if we scale up at a larger sense, because this is all kind of small scale, like me, the individual. If we scale up at a larger sense of behavior and activities, like we looked at in the city, right, destinations and things, this is also a problem in a similar way. Where before in the physical world, again, I was saying like it's very difficult for me to know it's impossible for me to know with total precision that this activity I'm going to partake in this place I'm going to go to, right, destination, activity, one and the same, it's going to be desirable. I'm going to have the exact experience I want when I go to this thing. Impossible to happen in the physical world. We talked about that. In the virtual and the digital, it's actually really, really easy to know what you're going to get into because everything's so well defined and so well reduced in a way, right? The advantage, though, is that because of the speed of the virtual, which, assuming there's good Wi-Fi, is instant, basically I have equal access to everything, which could be very liberating in a sense, because in the physical, it's not equal access. It creates inequality, right? The fact that everyone can access things equally at a time of zero, a distance of zero, in the digital sense, could be quite powerful, you know? So it's a weird thing where like I'm actually able to pre-select the experiences I want to have before I have them, because I know exactly what they're going to be, right? And I can have them instantly.
In this particular example, are you talking about like social media, like Instagram? Are you talking about Netflix? Are you like
any of that? And that more of the places where you actually network, and less of those that are just about consumption. More about spaces that are where ideas are exchanged. Yeah, but it could be applied potentially to consumptive activities only. I make the distinction, like I've heard the argument, like, well, you know, people always say everyone's on their phones now and it's a problem. Like, that's not a problem. People on the subway were always reading books before. Like, what's the big deal? I think there's a distinction to be made because, yes, when you're reading a book, you're occupying arguably kind of a virtual state, right? But you're not networking. It's not the place you go to have that process of display and feedback.
Well, even without that, you know, networking, it's usually if you read something, you are making yourself a better person in a way because you're trying to learn things or you are culturing yourself, right? Being on social media, I mean, you could call it networking, but if you're like posting a comment about somebody's new bra, like, is that really, you know, building up to a higher level, you know?
I mean, the danger is that we start... There's, I don't know how to describe, there's definitely activities where it's just about consuming, and that's like totally fine. But there's definitely time during the day where we recognize it's not about consumption. We're looking for feedback, right? We want to know how we're doing. I walk down the street to know how I'm doing, see how I look compared to other people, right? I talk to other people for exchange. We're looking for exchange. So I do think it's valid to say, it's valid that you know, the Instagram, Facebook, all these kinds of virtual spaces are not the same thing as like reading a book.
They're not, because reading a book is an activity, and living in a digital world is trying to take over living in a real one, which is problematic.
Yeah. So the other thing that happens is I was going back to the idea of destinations and then pre-selecting which destinations you want to experience and only experiencing those. Aside from the fact now you're excluding a bunch of stuff just because you don't like it, you're also eliminating any transition time. Whereas before, to go from one thing to the next, you had this distance, physical distance, and therefore time to travel to the next activity. It required effort. In the kind of digital space, that effort basically goes close, very close to zero. I can switch from one app to the next with a swipe. There's no...
Well, and that's where teleportation would be a huge problem.
Yeah, that's actually one.
I was thinking about the hyperloop, but then I kind of extrapolated it to the extreme, which my dream is teleportation. So I'm hoping someone out there is working on it. You know.
No, actually, that's exactly it. That's
right?
That's totally exactly it. Transportation, like true teleportation. I don't have to think about that, but for sure, like hyperloop and these kinds of things. Hyperloop within a city is, problematic for all of these reasons and all the ones we talked about in the past.
What if we all live on like individual islands and we use teleportation to go and see each other? Why not?
You'd only see your friends.
Well,
you'd only see your friends. So the experience of the day...
So that means you always have to experience the things you don't want in order for it to be good, in a way?
In a way. Yeah. Think about when people are given the option and the ability to do whatever they want, how many people abuse that before they're like, oh, fuck, I got to like reset. I actually have to stop eating crap and go to the gym. Or I got to stop. I've watched too much Netflix. I get burned out, right? There's something within us that knows it's a problem. But the issue is that we know it at that very internal, small scale. And in terms of looking at the global picture, there's just us, right? 3 days of watching Silicon Valley is too much, right? But we don't apply that same lesson to like urban planning and architecture or larger things even, right? This gets to technology. But so anyway, so the everyday experience before I described as eat, play, work, and you have these gaps between them. You travel like in odd distances and odd directions. Now, it's not that. It's just whatever desirable activity, desirable over and over and over next to each other. There's this continuation of these things. And what's weird about that is despite everyone being a distance of zero away from each other, physical space, there's physical distance, time distance. Digital space, if everything conceptually, theoretically is zero distance, then theoretically we're all on top or right next to each other. But because we're experiencing only what we want, we actually exist in parallel kind of tracks, right? This is not a new idea, but this is an interesting way to tie to the discussion. So everyone is experiencing what they want. I'm in form A. I want to experience more similar things. I just go down the A track. B is going down B. C is going down C. There's not a lot of disruption. The only disruption that happens is the algorithm, which is a lot of times designed to show us more of what we like, or the disruption is ads. But ads, I would probably argue, is not the most like profound. I wouldn't rely on it as a way to like compete with what public space, you know, brings in the physical world. So that's pretty much it for the virtual environment. I mean, so to kind of summarize, that the virtual environment is fully created and authored because it has no form. It only takes perfect forms, therefore. Therefore, it's the environments it creates has much control over the inhabitants. But
is it our brains and thoughts a semi-existence of the virtual world?
So, what do you mean?
Well, I mean the way we think. Like we don't think with our hands, right? We think with our brains, fine, but like there is something out there that's like clearly like controlling and like is more than just like cells and things. It's more than like a stomach digesting food, right? It is like, it has feelings, it has like emotions, it has memories, it has a whole kinds of things. Isn't that the original form of existence of a virtual world? In a way? Is it too abstract?
No, say it again. It's the original form of the virtual. Are you saying that the form of the virtual is totally equal to the form of the person, which is disconnected from the physical body?
I'm not saying that it's equal, but I'm saying that the form of the person that is disconnected from the body is probably the first existence of a virtual world before we even invented the virtual worlds.
Yes. But the distinction is that...
The distinction is that they can now connect virtually.
But only within my space.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Right. Because it didn't exist beforehand. Right. And there's limitations to this kind of analysis, but I think it's the ground, it's the framework. It's
pretty freaky. I mean, the virtual world, it's a pretty freaky thing. Like, if you think about it, it does not exist. It actually only exists in the physical world through like a medium, through images, through technology. But you get rid of that piece, that whole world is gone. Yep.
And that interface meaning like the phone, let's say for example, is becoming less and less present. Right? Like to access that space, well, actually this reminds me of something else I was going to say, which I forgot. But to access this other space used to require a lot of like, I don't know what, fussing around kind of thing. But that screen is becoming clearer and crisper and thinner. You know what I mean? Like that threshold's disappearing in a way.
But it's almost like, I don't know, it's so fragile. The fact that it all depends on a platform. I mean, the planet depends, our platform depends on the existence of the planet, right? If the planet gets destroyed, then we get destroyed and no one else, like that's it, that's the end. Yeah. I guess it's the same thing with the virtual world. Like, let's say all of the phone dies, or the servers on which like all of the virtual world exists, like crash, like that world is gone forever.
Yeah, potentially. But I think the thing is, and this gets into a whole different kind of focus and conversation about like the physical infrastructure required to create this virtual space that we don't think about, server spaces and things like this. The other aspect of So the public transportation transitional space completely gone to virtual. But the other thing too is that the virtual space, the reason why it's even more exclusionary is you have to elect to get into it. You have to choose to get into it, and you have to have the resources to get into it. The physical world, there, native physical world, we're born in it. And again, like I said, all space is public space until we say do otherwise. It's just there. The street is there.
Well, the virtual world becomes a destination then at that point.
It becomes a destination, yeah. But it's become so much part of our lives that it's more than that, right? But it is something. It's like a freeway you have to get onto, and now not everyone can get onto that because the reality is not everyone has enough money to have the right kinds of technologies. And now we're thinking like the entire human race. A lot of people, like it's not in their realm of possibility. So despite all those negatives, there are obviously some clear positives to the virtual and some clear negatives to the physical. And I'm going to talk about those now. So the first issue with the physical is that, right, there's a certain amount of inequality because we have to travel, which is also a weird thing because it creates public space. The other thing with the physical is that actually very, very few people have the ability or the knowledge or expertise or the opportunity to actually mold their environment. If we think about that, we all have the ability to move however we want, more or less, maybe buy certain clothings, right? But there's limits to that. But the number of people that are able to shape their larger environment, architecture, very, 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 very few. So that is a potential limitation because of resources and et cetera. And the same kind of critique applies to the virtual. Very, very few people are actually going to be the ones to create these spaces or architect them, design them. Like, small number. Part of me feels like that, the critique of like everyone's on their phones in public spaces and stuff like this. Part of me actually believes that the reason why that happens is because there is a thirst for authorship everyone has, and we just happen to live in a world now that we've created where everyone has a fairly low degree of authorship. They're given not much opportunity, and therefore they use this virtual space as an escape to feel like they're being productive or to feel like they're having authorship, right? Because of the expediency, they feel like they're authoring. But in fact, as I said, I don't think they actually really are, because it's a reductive process. But so the reason why we find people trying to leave, let's say, the physical kind of interactions for these other ones is because the physical world is people don't have the resources to make it what they want it to be.
I think it's because they're not happy.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they're not happy. They're escaping a situation that they're not happy in, and they're trying to get satisfied and happy by curating whatever thing they're going to do in the digital world that makes them feel good.
Yeah. But it's a kind of, I totally agree. I think when I was saying like people have an innate sense, desire to author, I think that is partly happiness.
They want control back over their lives.
Yeah, they need to express. They need to express as well. That's why we exist. That's what we do. And I think people more and more feel like they aren't able to do that because of capitalism and blah, 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 blah. And that's why we're escaping. It is a form of escapism. And I think that we should understand that when we go in these other spaces, it's a drug. It's like a micro drip drug, like a little burst of powerful stimulation. But the cumulative effect is nothing really productive or profound. It's just like, ooh, 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 sugar, 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 sugar. But
it is
not
almost like eating carbs, right? It's that the more you... No, it's true. It's like the
more you eat, the more empty.
The more often you eat it, the more often you feel like you need it. Yeah. And still you're still hungry, right? And
you're hungry because it's a reductive process. You're hungry because you're putting in not as much as you could. The system is allowing you to get rid of stuff. The system is actually forcing you to remove things. And the system itself it's always funneling. It's filtering. That's why it's not rewarding. That's why people like going out and seeing people in person generally. That's the reason, the happiness also comes from the reward. And this goes directly back to what I was saying before about like kind of presenting an idea of yourself, either through a speech or just for walking down the street and then getting information back. That's the reward. And you don't get that when everything's shallow and minimal. So one idea is that I think we have to shift the notion of freedom away from just the body, right, to the ability to express themselves through clothing, house, and fucking city infrastructure, sidewalks, billboards, transportation, everything, right? That I think if we lived in a city that more allowed that sense of authorship and co-authorship actually with other people, that we wouldn't have this kind of duality that we're living in. Now, this is an interesting thing about technology, and you reminded me of this. So the question kind of is like, why don't we design cities, build architecture, et cetera, live and govern ourselves as a society according to these understandings that I'm like proposing? And a lot of it's because when we first landed or evolved or whatever, right? Adam and Eve, or we came from monkeys, we had these other ideas to express ourselves. We basically have been using technology to overcome nature, right? So it's like and technology is like, it is being used in the broadest sense. We create irrigation, mass farming, whatever, transportations, to give us the freedom and the time to express the things that are important to us and not have to worry about like, I've got to feed myself because I'm going to die. I have to protect myself from, I don't know what animals are out there, right? And technology has been used was used up to a certain point to erase the needs for survival, right?
Well, Yeah, I mean, in a way, right? But I think it eventually overdeveloped our dependence on money, and therefore probably put another type of survival on us.
It,
right?
it totally did. Yeah, I totally agree with that too. Yeah, that's actually very interesting. So, what happens is back in that earlier process of when we're trying to again eliminate the need for feeding, protecting ourselves, and things like that. Basically, we're trying to gain time, right? So technology was used to expedite things, to control things, to be efficient, right? Those were the most desirable uses for technology to get us to the point to where now we can do whatever. The problem is, I think we've passed that. Not for everyone, for developed countries or whatever, we can say we've passed that. And so now technology has caught up so we can use it for other things, but we're still on the same mind track. We're still thinking, okay, technology, what do we use it for? Speed, efficiency, and growth. Now, I don't mean growth in a more philosophical, profound way. I mean growth and just bigger, more, faster. Prime now. We still have that mindset, and that's deeply problematic because we've gone past that, and now we're starting to erase the things like public space, like these experiences or whatever that we need. So I kind of propose that we have to shift our mentality so that technology is a means to an end, and so now technology has to be used as a means to a different end. The end to us was always speed and efficiency, but we didn't realize that that's actually just an end for form.
But I think it's like carbs. Like speed is the same thing as carbs. So seriously, like you get addicted to it. You want more, and then at some point you just stuck in it.
So we need a shift, and this ties into a lot of ideas about urban research and in urban research of efficiency and growth and development, right, of cities. Build it faster, quicker, more housing, more money, get me there faster. And there's something perverse about it, and there's something that's not right. And so I think we need to remind ourselves that technology is just a means, and that we got confused. We thought the means were the end, but that's not the case. That's not the end. Efficiency is not the end.
Well, and I think that's probably also why right now, like, portions of society is struggling living in the physical world, because the speed at which things move in the physical world is like so slow compared to the virtual one, right? Like you were saying, like building housing, well, we need a ton that's going to take years, and same time, like things could be done like this, like over your phone and things. So there is like this divorced relationship between the two platforms we're existing in between that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And it's probably because, like you said, the technology and the speed became the end, and actually probably should question itself and see how it could be implemented somehow into the other one.
Yep.
And co-create like something new, right?
Yes. This is also why I outlined that there's a difference between engineers and architects. Sorry, engineers out there. But engineers, they are designed. It's ingrained within them just to be concerned with ideas like efficiency and speed. They don't design. Design implies you have some other human motive, some other social motive that's dictating what the goal is.
Well, and that's actually when like you see pieces of technology that are very interesting is when you have engineering partnering with other types of designers and professionals, and they kind of question those things on the bigger picture and try to come up with something that's not just an answer to a problem.
Yes. So technology and our understanding of it has to shift. And there are, of course, a lot of people out here who understand this already. It has to shift from a task alleviator, right, to more of a mediator of human interaction and competition. There's that competition aspect I think is important, that, and maybe that's not the right word, or maybe that word sounds like a negative thing, or an undesirable thing, but it's necessary, it's necessary. So there is some way, I think there's a way to find basically what this third state of existence would be, a hybrid state where it's both virtual and physical, or you're using at least what we've learned through this research, through this conversation about those two, and you're putting them together. comes to even the most speculative part, which is like, okay, what would this future city be? And essentially, I've already set up everything, so now everything I said already outlines what the new city should be. But first of all, the technology in this new city would have to be embedded within it. So it's there from day zero. It's something you're born into. It's not optional. The problem, again, with digital spaces is they are optional. You have to go into them, right? If we want them to be productive in the sense that I'm talking about, they have to be embedded within the physical city fabric, or our experience of the city, we should say, always, and be totally ubiquitous. No more paying for internet, no more paying for a phone. There needs to be a base level that is just there. That's the first thing, right? Accessibility. The other thing, too, is that in a more theoretical sense. So, let's see. In the physical world, right, we have our conceptual self, and it gets realized, and it's messy. When it crosses that line, it gets distorted, right? The virtual, we cross that line, it's perfect. What this new city would do is take that line and make it fat, so that it intentionally distorts whatever you're producing to create that feedback loop that I was talking about earlier. In addition to that, so the virtual is about collapsing, the conceptual and then the real, and the physical, there's a single line of discrepancy. This city would actually have a band of stuff you have to cross to disrupt. Furthermore, that this new platform, because we're basically creating a new platform in the sense of physical platform, virtual platform, new platform. The new platform would obviously have to have its own form. And that form, like the physical, would have to be equally different from all of the people. And so I think actually that form has to be something that evolves and changes on its own, right? One is a way to be neutral. Two, as a way to disrupt, I think, more often. So you're actually increasing kind of like unpredictability in a way, right? To a certain degree. I mean, this is theoretical stuff, but I don't know how chaotic you want things to become. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's very abstract, but sure. Big band and shit that moves all the time. Okay, fine.
Okay. So I think the idea, though, the platform's form being something that's changing and redefining all the time is pretty interesting, because it's no longer kind of like a static host. Like the physical world is a host, but we more or less understand like how it's going to happen, right? And perhaps that's also why it's allowed us to create such controlling society. But if the platform itself is evolving, the form of it is evolving, then it's a much more dynamic mediator of things.
But when you said about the platform is evolving, are you saying in like spatially, formally, like in what
Not
sense?
even conceptually, in its form, conceptual form. The rules of it change.
Are you working on like season 20 of Westworld or something?
That's why I love sci-fi. Okay, so then of course, as we've talked before, the transitions between destinations, because we do exist and experience things through time, that's not going to change roughly. We don't eliminate those in this new city, even though we have the option to. We embolden them. Right. We do something with them to make them hyper public. Right.
Yeah.
So the improvisation of behavior is not just by our own forms, but the system itself is doing something to kind of incite this kind of, mixing up. We got to mix it up. Sounds crazy, I know. And a lot of people will be like, I don't want any part of that.
So,
but
are you currently
I think there's a way to do it.
So?
But all the things that I'm saying, it's not like it's happening always. You're living in chaos. It could be slow moving shifts in the form, so that it at least doesn't allow too much control of one person, agency, government, corporation. Could be. And what's interesting also is in the physical world, when you're on, let's say, the subway, you're sharing with it, and the subway's a pretty robust system, so you're seeing brand new things every day. but there's a little bit of repetition involved, right? You see the same people or whatever. But with the kind of virtual technologies or what it allows, which is the total disruption of time and space, you have the potential to take that track, that linear track, I don't mean physical track, the linear track, and it can be distorted completely. It can be bent in different ways, right? And it would allow openness to other things that don't exist in that physical space, right? Like, I would argue that
a crazy person a little bit.
I would argue that the virtual realm is mainly a series of similar experiences, variation on one very narrow theme.
Well, there's only one route you can take, really.
For what?
In the virtual world.
Because whatever
the number of routes that you can take to do things, to experience, or whatever you're doing in it is or has been created for you.
But I think it could be a way to disrupt. I mean, again, ads are a very good example. You're always getting bombarded with ads you don't like.
Well, that or things where they give you room not to hack, but to kind of like fuck around with the system a little bit, you know?
Yeah. People right now use their phones as a form of escape, right? Because they don't author. There is another aspect of this new platform is that because you're increasing that threshold between concept and reality, you're making that a wider band that you have to go through in a way that is what in turn allows for even more authorship by people. So it's in the end, like, what are you experiencing? You're experiencing like what you might describe as immediate, but also there's injections of things that are physically far, far away from you, right? And there is authorship happening. Everyone's authoring it. So the city is not like an oppressed kind of space, which is becoming more and more and more, especially places like Manhattan. It's a space that's co-authored by everybody.
Yeah. I mean, I think out of all of the cities, New York is probably the place that's been co-authored by a lot of people. I mean, you go to like smaller towns or places, like it's one tribe and, you know, like maybe one guy, so...
yeah, but even then, you know, New York, for financial reasons, immaterial reasons, is becoming so exclusive that you have to really question. So I think that if in this new platform, if it was designed correctly in these ways, that you would see the production of much more innovation. People would be happier potentially, and also you would find that there are more tribes than there are now. Like right now, people are having to conform a certain way because there's only, again, a set number of spaces, environments, etc., architectures, right? But with this kind of freedom, I think you would see that there's a much more variety, and that those tribes would be able to actually congeal and form their own kind of thing.
So when are you opening your Davidville?
I think it would be good, because then it would cause us to all really question. We would see new forms happening. We would question social values, explore new things. And so basically, I think, like, talking about city design and what we do, that we should be like the means and end. Like the point is to try and catalyze and propel people toward something that they don't fully understand or know yet. And they might not at first like that idea, because it's not, again, a series of just desirable experiences. But I think in the end, it's going to be more rewarding. The one question I did have
about your own thing,
is like, okay, the form of this platform is evolving and changing, like in artificial intelligence or whatever. But who's the person? Someone has to create that thing. That is a good question. But
it's a question of the chicken and the egg, right?
Yeah.
Like...
But I feel like there's a way to get around that, right? Again, it's degrees of authorship, actually.
Well, I mean, it could be something that's co-authored by everybody.
Yep.
And therefore, you don't have one person making it for everyone. Is like you're building a building, you're grabbing one brick, and then the guy's gonna do the grout, and you know, it's a collective effort.
And also the thing is, because the form is going to be always changing again at whatever pace, it doesn't really, you're not so concerned about a single person having too much control over it, because it's going to change. And it's not really there to, it's, the point of it is not to have a specific form. The point of it is to kind of be the morphing glue between things, the morphing mediator. That's its job, is to be this weird shaped thing. It's not meant to be a perfect square or perfect sphere. It's meant to be something bizarre that's between the two, that's always kind of wrestling with its own identity. Just as a way to, again, disrupt everything else enough to where we don't have probably the situation you're in, actually, now that I think about it, to disrupt enough to where we don't have what we have in both physical and the virtual currently. Right.
Like in principles, yes, this all makes sense. But how do you make it?
So again, embed technology across the city. It's free. It's there. It's as available as the air we breathe. It is part of survival, right? And we are basically talking about an augmented version of reality. So everyone has to be able to experience this thing that is a blend of virtual and the physical equally. And I'd have to think about this a little bit more. I mean, you've seen projects where it's like, oh, I put on Google Glass and now the subway looks clean instead of dirty, or like, oh, I'm talking to my friend who's not here, kind of thing. And all that always seems a bit superficial, but it's tiptoeing. It's like the toe in the water, I feel, you know. The thing that's interesting to me is like, is the ability for people to author is the question. That's the real question. And I think the biggest struggle is that people are used to authoring themselves and what they look like physically, like their bodies, what they look, makeup, clothes, what we look like, but they're not used to the idea of being able to author bigger things. And I don't know.
I mean, authoring is one thing. I think happiness is another big one. But I think to me, it's maybe more about making people participants again, instead of just being consumers or observant or, you know.
Maybe trying to figure out the whole thing at once is a bit difficult, but if you can solve the issue of public space and its eradication, that might be the key to the whole puzzle.
Well, and the whole public space situation right now is a pretty big question, right? Because if you do live in a world of risk of pandemics and viruses, but you still need, as a human being, to be able to go outside and do certain things and somehow relate and connect to the place you live in, the community you belong to, or you feel like you belong to, right? Or the people you love. Like, what is public space then? There is different needs, there is different, like, constraints you have to deal with. Now, actually, is public space partially digital, partially physical, you know?
Well, that's again, first I would say that whatever public space exists in the digital sense now is not actually public space.
It's not public because everybody can, buy $1,000 phone.
That's one reason, and all of the others of control and whatever. But I think... I'm not saying that people don't like public space and that physical exhaustion is a part of experiencing it, you know? I mean, that's why I'm very interested in modes of transportation, because there's something about seeing a city when you're walking on foot that's much more, there's more reward, there's more exchange, but it's potentially exhausting and takes a lot of time. There's something very isolating about the car. But maybe, again, this goes back to a lot of my other projects, maybe there's something between the two that allows us to have the richness of the experience of the city and all the stuff that we're talking about, but free us from our physical world form limitations, you know what I mean? So I that's what I think too, is I don't think that people are abandoning shared transportation zones and whatever, because they don't like them. Or I don't even know if it's because people don't like seeing others that aren't like them. I think it's because it's just comparatively, it just takes too much time and physical effort, like survive, like, you know, that base natural physical world effort of moving the body around and whatever. But if we can address that to a certain degree, I think the engagement would be there, you know. And it's just like, it's sparse. Things have become sparse. Like, you go to again, Union Square is an easy example. It's surrounded by big company things, Best Buy, Nordstrom's Rack, or whatever the fuck, McDonald's, you know. There's a lot of policing there.
Right, it's New York, right? Everything's bad money.
And there's a certain amount of safety which might entice a greater number of people in a certain sense, but there's something else. I think we do feel that there's a flattening of the experience. There's a filtering of it. It doesn't seem as rich as it could be. And I don't think that richness means you have to sacrifice safety. I think there's a way to have both. But it just tends to be that when we talk about safety, we go too far. We end up fucking killing a guy by leaning on his neck or whatever. Like, we don't understand that threshold. So I think there's a way to do it. I have some ideas. So if anyone out there, China government, you want to make a new city, you call me up and we'll build something pretty groovy, baby.
Good luck charting on your new city.
Yeah.
When I go back on my phone finishing my Sims game.
Okay, well, if you did listen to this, thanks. I have no idea what people think about this, but it's given the pandemic and being in Zoom and whatever all the time, and people talking about, oh, we're going to transition to like a different way of whatever. For me, if this is my foundation of where I come from for a lot of things, so it's like, well, maybe we should think about it from this perspective because there's another side to all this.
Well, and I mean, the biggest thing is like, you know, the disconnection to the cities we live in by all being, you know, turned inward.
It's the richness, right, that I think we're going to sacrifice. I think people are very quick to sacrifice the richness of the things that we talked about for, you know, more Zoom things or whatnot.
Yeah, like it's very interesting because either it questions the notion of like community versus individual.
Yep.
You know, and their existence or coexistence and need to coexistence, you know.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people left, again, to their complete own control. They choose to be individualistic, right? Over and over again. And that has a problem. And a lot of people, they choose gluttony. And a lot of people, again, they realize at some point that's not healthy and they change it. But we're finding there are a lot of people who don't do that. So maybe also this whole thing is a way to fucking force people to kind of understand that, no, I'm sorry, but none of us live in a vacuum. None of us live in complete isolation because what you're doing affects everyone else.
Right, Mr. Elon Musk.
What?
You heard me.
Why?
Yeah, fly away your rocket. Escape the whole pandemic in your mansion.
He has his own problems. He has his own problems.
All right, was that the outro?
No, okay. Again, thanks for listening. This is the Midnight Charette. We appreciate it. If you like what we're doing in general, leave us a review on iTunes in the podcast app. If you hate iTunes for some reason, then Spotify still doesn't allow reviews. That might change given the whole Joe Rogan thing. But until then, you can go on YouTube, leave a review there, or just send us some words of encouragement, and we can actually just use that on social media and kind of say, oh, someone send us a nice message.
Having problems there.
Tired now. What else is happening with us?
We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, sometimes YouTube. And we have some beer glasses available on our website for purchase. $12 for free shipping in the US. So feel free to get one for your mom for happy hour on her Zoom sessions on Fridays. And we also have a hotline. If you have any questions, you want to react, the number is 213-222-6950. If it's a question and you want us to go on about it, we can do an episode just about it. So
and this particular episode it's going to be on YouTube, and it might have slides. I don't know. We'll see.
Maybe.
We'll see. But anyway, you can find us on all those places. Reach out to us, and we appreciate that you're listening. And great things are coming. We're plowing forward, and it's good times. So thanks again, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.